This is a recording of the International Communist Party, which maintains its direct line running from Marx to Lenin to the foundation of the Third International and the birth of the Communist Party of Italy in Leghorn, Livorno, 1921, and from there to the struggle of the Italian communist left against the degeneration in Moscow and to the rejection of popular fronts and coalitions of resistance groups. Today we will be reading from our theoretical magazine, Communism, Part 1 of Race, Class, and the Agrarian Question in the United States, presented at the party's General International Meeting in September of 2024. Subsequent parts will be uploaded in separate videos. Part 1. Primitive Communism and a Manifest Destiny in the Early United States. 1. Overview. The first of the British colonies, Virginia, was founded in the period of mercantilism shortly before the British bourgeois established its ascendancy. As the colonies spread, in the ensuing years a backwards, semi-feudal slavocracy would consolidate itself in the South, while a Protestant theocracy based on communal property relations would emerge in the North, only to give way to a developing industrial capitalism after the American War of Independence. Within the early New England colonies before the War of Independence, a semi-barbaric form of communistic agriculture had developed under the British mercantile system, which intentionally underdeveloped its colonies. This would slowly give way to the advancement of private property under the emerging commercial power within the colonies. As no feudal aristocracy ever existed in North America, settlement brought the development of a multifarious independent yeoman peasant strata on the frontier, on the peripheries of the slave plantations in the south, and rural areas outside the urban commercial centers in the north. This element existed halfway between workers and halfway between the bourgeois. While itself never congealing into a cohesive and distinct class expression, it would struggle to maintain independence from domination at the hands of financial and commercial capital, up until the rise and consolidation of industrial capital, which would eventually eliminate any vestige of the independent small farmer from the historical stage. At the conclusion of the American War of Independence, an explosion of territorial aggression against the Indigenous of America and the opening of one of the first Indian Wars fought by the new bourgeois republic would occur. The push west would be made possible by enclosure of the New England commons and the flight of the now landless peasantry who sought to reestablish their old independence, seeing their hopes for the future with hopes and dreams with ascendant petty bourgeois, leaving a path of blood-soaked soil in their wake under the messianic, white nationalist project of Manifest Destiny. It is with the interests of this broad, variegated, petty bourgeois strata of farmer peasants that the genocidal, racist project of Manifest Destiny and the ideal of Jeffersonian democracy would come to most closely correspond. A petty bourgeois strata, often finding its basis in craftsmen and landless white workers fleeing the pressures of capital, which constantly worked to pauperize and enslave it to the shackles of wage labor in urban areas. Enclosure of the communal lands of the early New England townships would push masses of poor landless whites to find land by settling the West or face starvation or toil in the urban manufactures under the new slavery of wage labor. Subjected as they were by these titanic elemental economic forces into a position where their economic survival as a class strata was synonymous with advancing the project of colonial expansionism and the complete extirpation of the indigenous peoples, it was beyond any moral conviction of individuals who may have objected to hold back the extension of capital across the globe. As such, it could only justify itself to the Christian mind with the most dehumanizing form of racism, or, on the other hand, noble virtues of the white man's burden to paternalistically civilize the savages through the Bible or the bullet. The social project of Manifest Destiny would eventually bring these worker-farmer elements into alliance with the interests of industrial capital through the Republican Party, the Civil War, and the passage of the Homestead Acts. The invading armed hordes of Anglo-Saxon farmers would sweep across the American West, attempting to maintain the same lifeway of the independent peasant that was established in the wake of the barbarian revolutions against the Roman slavocracy over 1,000 years before. However, the conquering Germanic armies in the case of the American West were no liberators. Instead, they left behind their conquering horde a blood-drenched trail of mass murder and plunder of countless indigenous tribal nations on the path of a developing commercial and mercantile capitalism into the new age of industrial capitalism. The taming of the American frontier by Germanic independent farmers and the final outcome of the emancipation of the slaves, both historically progressive, represents the final chapter in the story of the German yeoman peasant. The ascendant northern bourgeois would continue to grow its power until it was strong enough to cast aside the fetter of the old southern slavocracy, which has maintained control of the federal government since the start of the Republic. At the conclusion of the Civil War in 1865, and during the ensuing period of Reconstruction, a labor movement of newly proletarianized ex-slaves would develop in the American South. This movement of unskilled black workers would arise just as northern craft unions began re-emerging, uniting, and consolidating their forces through the National Labor Union. Meanwhile, groups of German immigrants and followers of Marx within the International Workingmen's Association proselytized within the unions on the need to converge the nascent proletarian elements into class unions, free of racial exclusion, and independent of the political parties of other class strata. By the end of the 1870s, the impact of the economic crisis of 1873 would lead to escalating fears of black labor competition within the established craft unions, representing skilled labor, and within the strata of independent farmers in the South. These events would decimate the nascent forces of organized labor, leading to most of the established craft unions in the North adopting racially exclusionary policies, just as a campaign of terror directed against black workers continued to spread across the South. The result would be that Southern black people would be forced back into a state of peonage, and in the North, excluded from the unions. They would be pushed into impoverished urban ghettos to fill the ranks of the lumpen proletariat and the reserve army of labor. It is in this period that the Democratic Party, under the slogan of white supremacy, began to forge a new coalition of northern commercial interests and industrial capital on one hand, and on the other, elements of skilled craftsmen and farmers who feared black labor competition. It was a coalition which capital needed to wield in order to dismantle and disentrench the various long-established federal legislative policies and bureaucracies that comprised the project of Reconstruction. To do this, they needed to destroy the old labor capital political coalition under the radical Republicans. This coalition had emerged to advance the bourgeois revolution at a time when capital was faced with the real threat of a planter class restoration under President Andrew Johnson, following the assassination of Lincoln. Actually, for capital by the end of Reconstruction, it had a new enemy, the domestic and the international proletariat, and it could leave the unfinished business of the bourgeois revolution to be sorted out by natural occurrence of events. The victory of the movement of the Redeemers to establish white supremacist regimes across the South resulted in the reduction of the vast majority of Southern black people to the status of debt peonage by the end of the century. With the rise of Jim Crow and the growth of the KKK as a respectable mass movement in the early part of the next century, the true history of black workers' struggle in the period of Reconstruction would be subjected to an onslaught of historical obscurantism. Unsurprisingly, still to this day in most children's school textbooks, the whole period is often written off as merely a tale of misguided federal government overreach. Despite the erasure, it is in this period that the black proletarian masses would explode onto the historical stage in a flurry of struggle before Jim Crow shackled them back to the land. Our party has always emphasized the importance of the black proletariat within the U.S. workers' movement because of the unique conditions of their proletarianization having led to their status as the most highly exploited. Given this reality, it is no wonder that black workers continue to be disproportionately targeted for mass incarceration, subjected to prison labor, and extrajudicially killed at the hands of the ruthless police forces of the bourgeois state. Additionally, the unfolding of occurrences and the efforts of the followers of Marx in the period of Reconstruction demonstrate the total invariance of our party's directive of militating within the established unions, the absolute necessity of class unions open to all workers, and our complete rejection of all social chauvinism, which is the all-time obstacle of the fighting proletariat in all countries, the labor aristocracy. The period of Reconstruction will be explored more in Part 2 of this study. To understand this history in its full dialectical development, we must review the classic Marxist positions regarding the class dynamics and land relations in the early United States. 2. The primitive communism of the indigenous peoples of America. For Marxists, the term primitive communism refers to a communistic production method and land relationship that existed in human societies across the world before the development of social classes. private property, and state formations. In one sense, the communism of the future is a great return of humanity to the communism of the past. Within these societies, land is held in common. There existed no exploitation, no surplus value, no domination or class relations. While there was a division of labor, no hierarchy between men and women existed. The earliest form of family developed around the communistic household, the gens, or clan, a communal property-owning grouping which was a form of social organization. While there was much diversity in their levels of development and social forms, many indigenous peoples in North America, such as the Iroquois, were organized on this basis along with the ancient German barbarians, the early ancient Greeks, and others around the world. With these gens there existed cooperative decision-making and cooperation between all based on production for use by the community. Commenting on the communistic social practices of the indigenous peoples of North America, Engels stated in Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, all the members of an Iroquois gens were personally free, and they were bound to defend each other's freedom. They were equal in privileges and in personal rights, the sachem and chiefs claiming no superiority, and they were a brotherhood bound together by the ties of kin. Liberty, equality, and fraternity, though never formulated, were cardinal principles of the gens. These facts are material because the gens was the unit of social and governmental system, the foundation upon which Indian society was organized. It serves to explain that sense of independence and personal dignity universally an attribute of Indian character. The Indians of the whole of North America at the time of its discovery were organized in gentes under the mother right. The gentes had disappeared only in some tribes, as among the Dakotas. In others, as among the Ojibwas and the Omahas, they were organized according to father right. In the aforementioned text, Engels also drew direct parallels between the German Mark and the social practices of the Iroquois in America, which were both considered to be organized on essentially the same level of primitive communism given their communal management of the land. Commenting on their mutual method of unanimity in decision-making, he stated, "Among the Iroquois, the final decision had to be unanimous, as was also the case in regard to many decisions of the German Mark communities. The tribal council was responsible especially for the handling of relations with other tribes." To underscore the fact that for Marxists, primitive communism in many ways was no means inferior to the wretched society of capitalism, but instead represents the alpha of human social evolution. In the Communist Revolution and the Emancipation of Women, we state, primitive communism. This form is claimed in all Marxist literature and in fundamental pages of Marx and Engels, who did not exclude the necessity that between the ancient communism and the communism for which the modern proletariat struggles, forms have followed that arose with private property, class relations, and the tradition of their overlapping cultures. A frank glorification of that first form is in the pages of Capital and the Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. Despite distortions by modern falsifiers of Marxism in bourgeois academia, Marxism has never declared a totalizing, unilinear progression from one stage to the next, the world as divided into perfect and clean historical stages of development. Even in Russia, in the early 20th century was a society composed of peoples living on the land mass in various different land and property relationships. As we point out in Property and Capital, as Lenin described, the Russian economic landscape encompassed a blend of various economic forms, pre-mercantile, primitive communism, Asiatic lordship and theocracy, land baronetcy, mercantile, industrial, commercial, and banking capitalism, free private land ownership, and post-mercantile, early implementations of war communism, i.e. social warfare, such as free bread, housing, transportation in large cities, and similar provisions. In substance, primitive communism is a term denoting the land and production relations within ancient and indigenous societies before the rise of property relations. As we state in Property and Capital, these peoples existed within a material abundance. Property is a relationship between man, the human person, and things. Jurists call it the faculty to dispose of the thing in the most extensive and absolute way, and classically to use and abuse it. It is known that we Marxists do not like these eternal definitions, and we could better give a dialectical and scientific definition of the right of property by saying that it is the power of another person or group to prevent a human person from using a thing. The historical variability of the relationship can be seen, for example, in the fact that for centuries and millennia, the same human person was susceptible to being himself the object of property, slavery. On the other hand, we have proved 1,000 times that by referring to the primitive communist society in which property did not exist, since everything was acquired and used in common by the first human groupings, that the institution of property cannot claim the apologetic prerogative of being natural and eternal. In the relative primordial economy, or you could say pre-economy, the relationship between man and thing was as simple as possible. Because of the limited number of human beings and the limited range of needs, which are barely greater than the animal need for food, the things that satisfy these needs, which the law later called goods, are made available by nature without limit, and the only productive act is to take them when they are needed. They are limited to the fruits of wild vegetation, and later to hunting and fishing, and so on. There were useful objects in abundance. There were not yet products that came out of an embryonic physical, technical, manufacturing invention of man on the material offered by the natural environment. Just as the ownership of things or commodities for consumption and the ownership of slaves does not go back to primitive humanity, the same applies to the ownership of the soil, that is to say, the land, and all that man adds to it and builds upon it, immovable property, as it is referred to in law. Such property, in its privately owned form, comes later than movable property in slaves, because at the beginning, everything that is not commonly owned is at least attributed to the head of the familial grouping or tribe or city and region. But even if we want to dispute that all peoples started from this first communistic form, and even if we want to talk ironically about such a golden age, the analysis that interests us about the derivation of the legal institution from the stages of technology is not affected by it, and it is enough to refer to the great importance that Engels and Marx placed on these studies on prehistory from the very start, pushing us to go much further. If we limit ourselves to the skeletal outlines and the things known to all, the relations as to the ownership of the consumable and otherwise useful movable object, of the slave or serf, and of the land, this will suffice to define the fundamental outlines of successful historical types of class society. Beyond these land relations and the absence of property relations, we also outline the social relations of the society primitive communism. As we stated in Marxism of the Stammerers in 1952, man is for us the species, not the person. This bizarre, solitary, and evidently sterile being knows only consumer goods and not exchange, and not finding himself in the Garden of Eden, and besides the disadvantage of being deprived of Eve, he procures himself useful goods through his work. Our example from the past we draw from the primitive communities. Between the Manifesto and Capital, practical archaeological research has established that not only certain peoples, but every one of them had their origins and organizations based on the work of all and the property of no one. An organization where one finds labor in common or directly associated labor in its spontaneously developed form, which we find on the threshold of the history of all civilized peoples. Not unlike how we conceptualize the party prefiguring the communist society of the future. In commenting on primitive communism, we state in the Communist Party and the tradition of the left, primitive communities realized a very strict centralism and an absolute discipline of the single individual to the social group, without the need for coercion or any specific mechanisms. This was because it was founded exclusively on an identity of interests, and the solidarity of all, in the struggle against the adverse natural environment and other social groups. The primitive community is an example of centralized and differentiated organization without coercion. In the future communist society, it will be the same. Indeed, a fundamental Marxist thesis holds that only when an irreconcilable conflict of interests arose among members of a social group was it necessary to have a special coercive structure in order to obtain the same centralization that in the primitive community was obtained in a natural, spontaneous, and organic manner. that the centralistic execution of functions and the existence of a bureaucratic and coercive apparatus are definitely not the same thing is a concept only the social democrats, pilloried by Lenin in State and Revolution, are incapable of understanding. They, that is, who used to maintain that the need for a state machine was eternal, as otherwise individual interests would cause social breakdown, whereas, on the contrary, both a principle and a goal of communism is a stateless society in which there is no coercion of men, in which centralization will be total and far more complete than in present society, and founded on a natural and spontaneous solidarity among men. In describing the organization of indigenous tribes, based on observations of the American anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan, who had lived for an extensive period of time among the Iroquois, Engels stated, "What distinguishes an Indian tribe in America? 1. Its own territory and name. In addition to its actual place of settlement, every tribe further possessed considerable territory for hunting and lashing. Beyond that lay a broad strip of neutral land, reaching to the territory of the neighboring tribe. Both the early Anglo-Saxon settlers in New England and the indigenous people existed within their own racial communities, while in definite different stages of development, both maintained a communistic relation to the land. Despite their apparent cultural differences, both held communal land practices, maintained a form of unanimous decision. A society of common material bases led to very similar forms of political and social organizations. Despite both being misattributed by bourgeois academics as shining examples of democracy, their egalitarian social form was only a product of their cooperative mode of production and relation to the land. While these two racial groups would be driven towards conflict with each other over land disputes, unable to integrate with each other out of racial and ethnic animosities, born from the racially and ethnically homogeneity of their respective societies, which formed the foundation of their unity, culture which had developed over millennia. These disputes are natural to early human societies at this stage. However, it would be on the titanic movements of capital and the development of the bourgeois that would propel the settlers of the British colonies toward a project of conquest and ethnic cleansing. 3. Race and nation in state formation in America. Unlike the bourgeois who view race either as merely an ideological construct or as comprising essentially a hierarchy of different subspecies of humans, as within social Darwinism, in the Marxist literature, the terms race and ethnicity are used interchangeably. We understand race and ethnicity to be biological and material fact in that they are directly tied to the emergence of different means of production within primitive communities, be that tools, language, and customs in different groups of humans, which develop their culture within isolated and homogeneous tribal communities and bands over millennia. Over time, this led to the development of genetic and physical characteristics of difference within the human species, just as any species of animal has evolved over time when isolated from others of its kind for long periods of time. However, more significantly were the different cultural customs, tools, and linguistic distinctions which arose. Yet today, because of the expansion of global markets and mixing of populations which began millennia ago, such differentials have progressively evaporated to the point of almost complete irrelevance in the modern world. However, in prehistoric times, members of these various tribal and ethnic groups hardly viewed themselves as members of the same human community, and instead viewed outsiders mostly as inhuman creatures, or spirits in some cases. With the arrival of Europeans to North America, these formerly isolated two great masses of humanity came into contact. Europeans living as they did in cultures with animal husbandry brought with them a mass pestilence that decimated indigenous populations. Given that most indigenous people in North America lived within societies with land relations reflective of a primitive communism, it meant that the English colonies and their expansionist endeavors would have the perpetual task of destruction of this primitive communism and the expansion of social class relations throughout the land. This could only happen through a conquest and total extirpation of these native peoples from the land, given their complete incompatibility of the two social forms. Whereas European mercantile colonization in places such as Mexico, Peru, India, China, and some parts of Africa encountered societies which had already developed into large, sprawling state formations complete with developed agricultural production, a distinct hierarchy of social classes, and established property relations, Most North American tribes still lived in a state of primitive communism, with some exceptions, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. The existence of relatively large groups of natives who lived without any state structure, compared to the early groups of English colonists, made them an extremely difficult group to conquer and assimilate. We can compare the rapidity of Spanish colonization in Mexico after the conquest of the Aztec Empire, for example, as the elements of established local ruling elites swore fealty to the crown and converted to Christianity, and the conquistadors intermarried with the indigenous, establishing large ethnic groups of mestizos in many places. Given the absence of any centralized state formation, the process of colonization in the United States would take a much longer time, as this new state formation had to be created almost totally anew. Thus, for the stateless indigenous peoples and nations who lived in relationship to the land, reflective of a primitive communism, and whose material, ethnic, and cultural practices had developed out of that relationship to the land, they would have to be forcibly extirpated as the nascent bourgeois worked to extend their markets, property relations, and their system of production through to the interior. In Factors of Race and Nation in Marxist theory, we state, the transition from the ethnic group or people to the nation only takes place with the appearance of the political state, whose fundamental characteristics are the delimitation of national boundaries and organization of the armed forces. This transition can thus only take place after the dissolution of primitive communism and the formation of social classes. The precondition for the emergence of the state is the formation of social classes. Among all peoples, this formation is determined by the division of arable land between individuals and families, and, in parallel, by the different phases of the division of social labor and functions, which results in each of the various elements in general productive activity being accorded a particular position and the appearance of differentiated hierarchies responsible for elementary crafts, military action, and religious magic, the first form of technical know-how in schooling, the latter detached from the immediate life of the gens and primitive family. The Germanic Anglo-Saxon Protestants who came to settle in New England re-established a very old form of communistic property and land. These townships were surrounded by hostile indigenous bands and tribes who obviously resented the invasion of their lands. From their origins, these townships and the early settlers organized themselves as a fortified armed camp, fenced in and enclosed, guarding itself against the outside world and the native racial other. A nation, complete with its social classes, political state, national boundaries, and armed forces, was developing, which was fundamentally incompatible with the primitive communism of the native population. Thus, this nation began over time to incorporate into its identity completely antagonistic interests with that of the racial other and the native peoples of the Americas. Noting the barbarity of the early Protestant colonies directed towards the native, Marx wrote in Capital Volume 1, in 1703, those sober exponents of Protestantism, the Puritans of New England, by decrees of their assembly, set a premium of £40 on every Indian scalp and every captured redskin. In 1720, a premium of £100 was set on every scalp. In 1744, after Massachusetts Bay had proclaimed a certain tribe as rebels, the following prices were laid down. For a male scalp of 12 years and upwards, £100 in new currency. For a male prisoner, £105. For women and children prisoners, £50. For the scalps of women and children, £50. Some decades later, the colonial system took its revenge on the descendants of the pious Pilgrim Fathers, who had grown seditious in the meantime. At English instigation, and for English money, they were tomahawked by the Redskins. The British Parliament proclaimed bloodhounds and scalping as means that God and nature had given into its hands. As it was, the exploitative economic interests of the early mercantile colonial capital, which financed the early colonies, and whose interests the settlers ultimately served, the development of a deep-seated national hatred against the racial other was inevitable and necessary for capital's accumulation and expansion. The treasures captured outside Europe by undisguised looting, enslavement, and murder flowed back to the mother country. The colonial system proclaimed the making of profit as the ultimate and sole purpose of mankind. As the early settlements began to expand, they made alliances with tribes and war with others. They constantly played a game of intrigue between the different tribal groups and worked to extend and establish hegemony over the territories it exerted influence over. As it did so, it often extended sovereignty over its former allies and their territories in a paternalistic fashion. It would begin to treat the indigenous as children and wards of the state in many cases. 4. The revival of ancient Germanic farming practices in the New England colonies. In Kautsky's 1902 work, Socialist Agitation Among Farmers in America, he recognizes the unique conditions of the United States in relation to the agrarian question, and praises the book. The American Farmer, written by socialist Algie Martin Simmons, the editor of the International Socialist Review, as especially well done. Despite disagreements about the prospects of winning farmers to the cause of socialism at that time, Kautsky describes the book as a critical text in understanding the material and historical conditions of the agrarian question in America. Thus, the text marks an essential source in understanding the Marxist view on the developing class dynamics within the United States, which were intimately bound in the agrarian question given the existence of the frontier and the westward pull. In the text, he describes how the initial colonies in New England were small townships with a communal property relation ruled by a strict Protestant theocracy. He describes these early settlers as establishing communities based on the same model that was, in essence, those of the old communal German Mark, which had disappeared in Europe hundreds of years before. The first settlers of New England came from a European society that was still in the social stage marked by common ownership of village lands. But economic conditions in New England developed at a much earlier social stage, and so we see a reproduction of European institutions of centuries long by. So close was the resemblance to these earlier days that one of our foremost historians can account for it only on the ground of conscious revival or inherited custom. In reality, the same economic conditions that in the time of Tacitus caused the formation of isolated communistic settlements in Germany produced the same results in New England. The first settlements in America, like those of the early Germans, were but little clearings in the midst of the forest surrounded by hostile Indians with no strong central government to preserve order and protect the settlers from their savage neighbors. Fences erected by common labor shut the village off from the rest of the world. The same forms of social organization, the independent German farmer, organized around the communal village of the Mark, and its eventual disappearance with the rise of the feudal lords, are discussed extensively by Kautsky in The Agrarian Question. In Factors of Race and Nation in Marxist theory, our party also observed that the Germanic peoples moved from a nomadic horde to be described as settled peasants, likely due to a rapid growth in population. In our text, we note that it was the barbarians who overturned the Roman slavocracy and broke up the plantation estates, implementing a form of communist land cultivation in its stead. Given the relatively small number of conquerors and their tradition of communist labor, the new organization of agriculture in these lands left large areas undivided, not just forests and pastures, but also arable land, with German forms of law prevailing over Roman forms, or combining with them. Eventually, this form of agriculture would give way to feudalism in Europe, as strong lords began bringing the independent peasantry under their domination. Then this development would eventually give way to the birth of the modern European nation-states. However, in the United States, it experienced a curious revival given the conditions and class relations within the early colonies, which required strong independent farmers that could organize defense and without expensive centralized state support from the mother country. The New England colonies had themselves attracted less slaves and indentured servants than in the South, and the Virginia colony, as the land was less suitable for extensive agriculture. The influx of refugees to the New England colonies from the homeland, fleeing the advance of the bourgeois revolution there, would continue to put population pressures on the settlers to expand and eventually thrust the Anglo-Saxons into a project of nation-state formation as the regional bourgeois developed and eventually sought to break out from under bourgeois mercantilism. We can understand that for the New England colonists, who had once lived in this form of communistic land relations, the enclosure of the land, their pauperization and thrust into the cities to be consumed as fodder for the developing manufacturers, led to a desperate push west where they dreamed of maintaining their old social statuses based on their old communistic land relations. This, of course, came at the bloody expense of extirpating the native from his own primitive communism. The ruthless genocide of the native, the development of the Germanic, Anglo, white American nation, and the colonial project of extending capital's market west would go hand in hand. 5. The American War of Independence and westward expansion. With the first English colonies being founded prior to the beginning of the English revolutions in 1607, they remained small, with only a few thousand, until the advent of the Revolutionary period, swelling over 400% in the decade of 1640 to approximately 30,000, then to 210,372 by 1690, as masses fled the tumultuous events in the home country. As the English Revolution commenced and completed itself, it brought new immigration waves of war refugees and landless farmers who found themselves landless due to enclosure. The American War of Independence brought small bourgeois, artisans, workers, and farmers against British commercial interests and finance capital. As such, in the coming War of Independence, British mercantilism would find itself allied with the indigenous peoples of North America, who both sought to aid them in the development of an independent North American bourgeois and capital. Under the colonialism of the British Empire, the underdevelopment of their colonial territories was central to their global dominance, the production of raw materials in the peripheries of the barbaric stage of development. Thus, the New England colonies could themselves exist in a sort of semi-barbaric communistic stage within the mercantile colonial system. In order to maintain their position, Britain and its manufacturers had to remain the progenitor of finished goods for export across the world. The British would intentionally prevent the development of alternative poles of commercial manufacture from developing within its empire. The mercantile monopoly of Britain had organized its colonies as producers of raw materials for export to England, where they would be manufactured into finished goods for sale across the empire. British colonialism had imposed a monopoly on trade, requiring purchase of its own exports, blocking the development of manufacture in its colonies to reduce competition with its domestic industry, and mandated itself as the sole receiver of colonial exports. In its American colonies, it imposed extensive restrictions on production, banning locals from even making hats, prohibited settlement west of Appalachia, minting of coins, and local banks. With the rising power of the urban middle classes and the petite bourgeois in these colonies, these conditions increasingly became unendurable. In the late 18th century, the population boomed from just 250,888 in 1700 to 2,780,369 in 1780. This demographic explosion created increasing demand for new land among the masses of farmers. The citizen soldier who formed the basis of the Continental Army was an independent peasant, and indeed more than 90% of the colonials made a living off the land at the time of the war. Thus, land acquisition was a primary motivation for many in the war. Meanwhile, real estate speculation grew as a major economic factor within the colonies. Following the French-Indian War, the British reneged on promises to grant land west of Appalachia to those who had fought, in fear of an alternative commercial hub developing that could threaten its mercantile domination. Major land speculators such as George Washington faced the potential total devaluation of 30,000 acres of land. Similar facts were true of many of the other founding fathers of the soon-to-be American Republic. This, along with the other aforementioned material drives, created the conditions for the material American War of Independence. At the conclusion of the war, the vast territory west of the Appalachian Mountains, which was ceded to the United States by Britain in the Treaty of Paris, 1783, effectively doubled the size of the new nation. However, the soldiers would find much difficulty initially in gaining access to the new land grants they were promised. In order to begin developing its own industry, the urban bourgeois required the mass dispossession of the New England farmers. It needed to drive them into wage labor and into the cities, where the manufacturers were located. Following the end of the war, masses of independent farmers found that the old commons had begun to be enclosed and sold off, and they were now landless. This process, beginning in part to repay war debts, led merchants to begin demanding payment in money in exchange for goods, which forced masses of farmers into extreme poverty and debt. This had the intended outcome. Many poor farmers were driven into parceling and selling their land, becoming cheap wage laborers for the developing manufacturers. Others were forced to make the dangerous and risky trek west to attempt to eke out a living, an outcome which satisfied the wealthy land speculators who needed to increase the value of the lands they had purchased to turn a profit. Conditions were so bad for the average farmer that it led to a developing popular unrest and protests across the country that eventually boiled over, with the exception of Shays' Rebellion, where 1,500 armed farmers outraged over debt collection and lack of land dispersal went into open rebellion in Massachusetts and attempted to storm a military armory. The newly developed centralized government swiftly put down the rebellion, with almost all of the Founding Fathers exposing their new ruling class status, harshly denouncing the insurrection. 6. The Independent Peasant. The American farmer was an extremely heterogeneous strata within American society, with various practices and methods employed suited to the natural environments of each area. In Simon's The American Farmer, he notes, "When we speak of the American farmer, then the greatest care and the widest knowledge is necessary if we are to avoid ascribing to the type what is characteristic only of a single section or class. In the West, the cattle rancher and cowboy would eventually come into existence. In the prairie, farmers had access to fertile lands that allowed them to outsell the relatively poor New England farmer, and in the South, of course, the slave plantation labor was predominant. However, in the periphery, there existed a crust of independent yeomans and frontiersmen, often living relatively isolated and rugged lives of self-sufficiency. However, one thing united this section of the population, and it was that ultimately they comprised a layer of independent, almost totally self-sufficient farmers. In Kautsky's The Agrarian Question, he is careful to outline that a farmer is only a latter-stage peasant who is no longer independent, by way of their production no longer producing for subsistence, but primarily commodities for export on the market in exchange for money. Given that it was only after the Civil War that most farmers began moving from subsistence farming to cash crop commodity production, we can understand that in the United States, the vast majority of farmers were in fact members of an independent peasantry until later in history. This layer of an independent peasantry in the United States was caught in between an identity of a worker and a petty bourgeois, for it was always the aspiration of the farmer and the independent proprietor to accumulate enough wealth to either purchase a slave or two or hire helping hands. According to Lenin, in The Peasantry and the Working Class, the so-called working peasant is in fact a small proprietor, or a petty bourgeois, who nearly always either hires himself out to work for somebody else or hires workers himself. Being a small proprietor, the working peasant also vacillates in politics between the masters and the workers, between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The confusing interplay between worker and peasant that was created by the existence of the frontier, which acted as a pressure valve for pent-up urban anxieties amongst the American workers and drove the northeastern capitalists to be forced to encourage European immigration to fill the developing manufacturers, can be seen in the writing of Kautsky in Socialist Agitation Amongst American Farmers. He writes, "Workers did not feel as a proletariat." However, the continued existence of the independent farmer strata depended upon the constantly expanding frontiers, which gave access to adequate farmlands for a family to sustain itself and reproduce its existence, which required the continual and growing availability of adequate land. Commenting on the role the frontier played in delaying the development of strong proletarian organizations, Simmons and the confusion European socialists had on the situation, he states, "In this country, the element which in other lands was in continuous revolt against social injustice had here simply moved on to the frontier, and that therefore it would be where that frontier was last located that social discontent would find its first strong, united native expression." 7. Manifest Destiny, the Frontier, and Native Genocide. The War of Independence had been fought on two fronts, one against the British and the other on the frontiers against the natives, who had chosen to ally with the Crown because of the threat to their land. Eventually, after the war, the lands were parceled and settlers began to flood in. The frontiersmen, the independent farmers who settled in these newly acquired lands, came with muskets in hand, as it was their job to enforce the new property relations, to defend their newly parceled and fenced private property in the newly settled lands, in areas where there was little to no centralized state authority. In all such newly settled areas, raids from natives who attempted to defend their lands from encroachment and to evict the new settlers were a constant threat, so the settlers were at once farmers and also enforcers of the new order. Following the War of Independence, the indigenous raids escalated to the point of war. George Washington mobilized an army against the Northwest Confederacy composed of the Shawnee, Miami, Lenape, and Ottawa, who had formed to resist the colonization of their region. In one key battle, the tribes inflicted the worst defeat at the work of the natives against the U.S. military in history, forcing the government to sue for peace. However, a boundary line could not be decided, and the war resumed with the Confederations, defeated over 10 years later. The native populations had always posed a serious military threat, and indigenous warriors were highly feared by settlers. Their mere sighting would often lead militia units to flee the field of battle in terror across many conflicts. Indigenous peoples in the region would again rise up during the War of 1812, uniting under the leadership of a Shawnee warrior by the name of Tecumseh, who would form a confederacy of tribes that would ally with the British and play a key military role in the war as they worked to expel the U.S. from the region. Following independence, Thomas Jefferson began popularizing a version of the yeoman farmer democracy, which was spread over the entire continent. In regards to the indigenous peoples, he referred to them as the doomed red race that would be exterminated or driven beyond the Mississippi. As settlement continued west, it occurred through paramilitary units and vigilante groups of settlers who would work together to push native people off the land. Periodic open warfare between the United States Army and confederations of tribal war bands would occur with the occasional native raid on settlements. As a result of rapid depopulation of indigenous peoples occurred from mass murders, plagues, starvation, and land evictions. As time went on, the remaining natives were concentrated onto lands deemed worthless and unsuitable for self-sufficiency, in what were and continue to be called reservations. The support for these policies among the bourgeois layers were widespread. In Simon's American Farmer, he notes, "It is extremely interesting, to say the least, to note that had independence not been gained, Washington would have lost about 30,000 acres of rich western land. The possession of land carries no benefits unless it carries with it the power to appropriate the fruits of other men's labor. Manifestly, if the owner is to secure any such fruits, he must somehow get men out to where his land is located." So it was that the governing powers gave all possible encouragement to this westward movement. The result of all these tendencies was that a mighty army of conquest and occupation poured over the mountains and down the rivers into the wilderness. They were the first members of that ever-fleeing, yet ever-conquering host that from that time, almost to the present moment, has been fleeing from the exploitation and monopoly of the East, only to create in the new home a new tyranny from which in turn their sons must flee. This army moved in irregular but fairly distinct battalions, each of which held the field for one social stage, and then gave way to the elements that were to form a higher and more complex society. The first body to invade the wilderness were the hunters and trappers, but close upon their heels came the pioneer farmers, the real advance guard of the invading army. These pioneer farmers, who for well nigh a century were the typical Americans, had set before them as a task the conquest of a continent. Thus the middle-class American dream, a modern adaptation of the Jeffersonian ideal of the independent peasant-farmer democracy, emerges at this historical juncture. Secured over the corpses of untold numbers of native casualties, in Colonization and Christianity, a popular history of the treatment of the natives by the Europeans in all their colonies, 1838, which Marx studied in 1851, writing at the time of the Trail of Tears and the massive removal of the Native American tribes, how it concluded with the words, "Nothing will be able to prevent the final expatriation of these southern tribes. They must pass the Mississippi till the white population is swelled sufficiently to require them to cross the Missouri. There will then remain but two barriers between them and annihilation, the Rocky Mountains and the Pacific Ocean." In the United States, this path of the petit bourgeois westward to accomplish their dream of economic independence and self-sufficiency would justify itself under the social doctrine of manifest destiny, a doctrine which viewed it as the inherent God-given destiny of the nation to extend from coast to coast. The rise of the Democratic Party's slogan of white supremacy, then in the period following Reconstruction, would work to consolidate this new national identity as the converging forces of capital sought to continue its hyper-exploitation while wagging the carrot of petite bourgeois status in the face of the declassed American independent farmers, craftsmen, and then proletarians. Manifest destiny, a doctrine which gave high ideals to a project of expansionism, was at its core driven by impersonal material forces of capital accumulation that would, in an unstoppable and inevitable way, spread its bloody tentacles across the entirety of the globe. These conquests, historically progressive, were put forward as a social panacea. However, the peasants will not preserve their independent status, and all of American life will eventually become dominated by the forces powerfully revolutionary of industrial capital. Its progressive proletarianization of the masses continues today, despite the existence of a large but shrinking labor aristocracy. Capital always ruins the free peasants, but at the same time deludes them in seeking their support against the working class. Even Nazism in Germany, at the other end of the bourgeois historical cycle, made the small peasants heroes in its ideology, the true representatives of the nation. They saw in them the responsibility for the German racial strain and German history. Instead, urban culture was labeled as asphalt culture, Jewish. In essence, it was a petite bourgeois dream of a renewed independent peasantry. Capital, in its expansive fury, is anonymous and global, indifferent to race, a powerful unifier of peoples and cultures, but it becomes racist exterminator as soon as it becomes useful to its needs, of affirmation or survival, at the beginning or end of its journey. So Hitler will write, "Here in the East, a similar process will repeat itself for the second time, as in the conquest of America. Our Mississippi must be the Volga." After the economic crisis of 1873, we would see the campaign of white supremacy under the Democratic Party's Redeemers movement in the South and its ultimate alliance under the emergent National Industrial Capital, a project which aimed to crush the workers' organizations and the radical Republican regimes that had been established in the South after the Civil War in the time of Reconstruction, liquidating the racial other, the proletarianized ex-slaves. Prior to the rise of the black shirts in Italy and the brown shirts in Germany, it is in the United States that we see the first manifestation of the fascist shirts movement, as they would later be called in Europe. The most obvious being the white supremacist red shirts in Mississippi and the Carolinas, and of course similar groups in the KKK and White League. These paramilitary organizations, with their connection to the Democratic Party, utilized terroristic tactics in the period of Reconstruction South. 8. White nationalism, the American craftsmen, and the labor aristocracy. Prior to the Civil War, the vast majority of people in the United States were of the middle classes, either independent yeoman peasant farmers, urban craftsmen, or independent artisans. Small firms and workshops that used manual tools still far outnumbered factories in 1860. Likewise, in 1790, 9 out of 10 Americans lived completely off the land. By 1860, it was still 8 out of 10. The economy of the small farmer was based on self-sufficiency, as well as tilling the soil and stock raising and related agrarian industries. Other activities such as spinning and weaving were carried out inside the family unit. As we said in our history on the labor movement in the United States, within the small workshops for which most of production was organized, there was the proprietor of the workshop, the master, the skilled worker, the journeyman, and the apprentice. The artisan was equipped with a set of typical tools of his craft, enabling him to make the finished product. The masters were proprietors who did everything, from maintaining relations with their customers and ordering raw materials to keeping the accounts. In addition, they planned the work, supervised their young apprentices, and worked alongside their subordinates. For the most part, they were ex-skilled workers, expert workers formerly paid by the day or on a piecework basis, depending on the craft. These journeymen, in their turn, had been apprentices, who had started in their trade while still adolescents, and spent from 3 to 7 years learning the secrets of the craft under the tutelage of their master. The Industrial Revolution in North America was preceded by a period between the 1820s and 1840s in which the craft workshop underwent major changes. The first important transformation was an increase in the number of people employed in the workshop, rising to a few dozen or so, and threatening the traditional equilibrium between the three roles just described. The consequence was richer proprietors, less and less hope for the journeymen of setting up on their own. We can date the precocious death of the American dream to this period, with its subsequent existence a mere mirage for the overwhelming majority of proletarians, and apprentices seen more and more as low-cost labor rather than as future artisans. There then followed the transformation of the mode of working typical of the factory, whether through the introduction of machinery or by subdividing the working process into a number of simple phases, allowing non-specialized and therefore cheaper and easily replaceable labor to be taken on, such as women and children. The two opposing classes meanwhile started to define themselves and clarify their respective identities from a theoretical point of view, with the rising bourgeoisie certainly more prolific in this respect. Adam Smith was one of the principal sources of American bourgeois ideology during this period, an ideology which would eventually develop into the postulate of free labor, which even now, reduced to an empty illusion, gets between our feet today. The ideal society, supposedly, is one in which there is a minimum of political interference in the market and in production, the dynamics of which are supposed to naturally favor the attainment of economic independence on the part of the farmers and the workers, if, that is, they are sufficiently diligent and industrious. In short, it is a theory of the self-made man. Everyone has the possibility of making money. How is irrelevant. After all, where there's a will, there's a way. What is more, free labor is considered the founding ideology of the Republican Party, which would form as such in the mid-1850s. Following the War of Independence, the advancing commercial revolution pushed non-market systems of exchange and barter out of the way. This led to a progressive decline in the independent farmers and craftsmen, and eventually, a group of entrepreneurs began to emerge, who were not just proprietary master craftsmen, but determined to make money at all costs. As manufacturers developed, within the crafts and its old guild system of master and journeyman, a rift began to emerge between the proprietors and non-proprietors, and eventually, the two began distinguishing themselves completely, which gave rise to the birth of the first workers-only craft unions. As the manufacturers grew, it led to an increased demand for more and more unskilled labor. Immigrants were often directly imported as strikebreakers at this time. Thus, many of the first policies of the craft unions were aimed at keeping out immigrants, often directed against Germans fleeing the failed German Revolution. In fact, many of the policies of the early International Workingmen's Association, IWA, were around mutual compacts between workers not to immigrate to each other's countries and work for wages which undercut the wages of other laborers. For example, through the IWA in 1871, American and British molder societies reached an understanding where they laid down mutual rules for the entrance of immigrants from their trades into the United States. We see here two approaches, one aimed at stopping immigration through binding themselves with bourgeois political parties, and another at arriving at a mutual strategic pact with workers internationally. The first, of course, is a pact made on the basis of a common national chauvinist interest with ruling classes, and the second, an internationalist proletarian approach, which recognized a shared class interest and action based on mutual solidarity. While these early unions would organize for collective action, their activity was often of an incoherent class character, and often also partially existed to develop collective funds to start up cooperative enterprises, as it became more and more difficult for individuals to do so. The pull of the West ultimately acted as a pressure release valve due to the possibility of making it an independent proprietor elsewhere. A prime example of this is in the Cooperative Commonwealth founded in 1888, to which Eugene V. Debs would briefly become president of. After the American Railway Union was broken by federal troops and dissolved in 1877, its remnants joined with various colonizing groups, socialists and union locals, and radical religious organizations to form the Social Democracy, with Debs as chairman. The organization aimed to colonize the Pacific Northwest, establish cooperative industry, and build a new economic system that would abolish wage slavery. The leaders of the movement compared it to those of the Free Soilers in settling the state of Kansas to prevent the spread of chattel slavery. However, it was eventually realized that these projects were pulling workers out of the urban movement, and so this particular project was abandoned. Given the constant prevalence of economic crisis in this early capitalism, unemployment was a huge concern. The fear of immigration was matched by a fear of free black slaves competing on the labor market. Thus, there are many examples in the North of white and black craft unions viciously competing and attacking one another. As early as 1858, black caulkers and organized German and Irish caulkers in Baltimore rioted against each other after the white associations worked to push out black labor from the trade. Meanwhile, Democratic Party newspapers by the end of the war would use their racist rhetoric to incite white workers against black as a scapegoat for economic problems and unemployment, a tactic that would continue on for a century, leading to many pogroms and massacres perpetrated by white workers against black workers throughout the country. During the Civil War, Democratic Party newspapers incited whites to pogrom violence against blacks, blaming them for unpopular draft measures. Meanwhile, after the war, Northern capitalists increased their use of black workers as strikebreakers, often intentionally recruiting them from the South so as to encourage the racial divides and hatred. In 1863, a strike of 3,000 longshoremen was broken because the boss used black strikebreakers. Following the war, fears were stoked about companies being formed to ship 200,000 to 300,000 black workers in the North to act as strikebreakers across New England. Despite this, during the war, more and more black workers in the North began getting organized. While many labor unions remained friendly and the leadership of the National Labor Union under Silvis insisted on non-discriminator unions, many had already begun shutting out black workers long ago. Particularly in the South and in the North, many were indifferent to the plight of black workers. The National Labor Union under Silvis had originally organized itself as a project open to both white and black labor. However, after his death, the exclusionary attitudes and policies of white workers would force black workers out of the Union to form their own. In the early days of the Knights of Labor, it had prided itself on its racial inclusion with 60,000 black members. However, over time, many incidents of racial opportunism on the part of leadership on a local and national level and at the base of the organization began slowly to break the solidarity. After the economic crisis of 1893, the skilled labor element within the Union began retrenching itself and binding itself more closely to the boss. By this time, within the Knights of Labor, black membership was almost non-existent, with the organization passing resolutions calling for the deportation of blacks to Africa the following year at its Congress. Meanwhile, in 1893, the AFL would officially reverse its ban on accepting racially exclusive unions, leading to the eventual complete abandonment of its commitment to racial inclusion, and the rise of a form of Jim Crow unionism. Thus we could see that in many cases, despite leadership's best efforts to encourage racial unity, the deep-seated racial hatred that had become a basic element of the national identity was an all-too-easy pull for social chauvinist elements within the labor aristocracy to mobilize around. The predominance of the petty bourgeois, the early development of a labor aristocracy out of the original crafts, and the unskilled proletariat in the form of ethnic and racial other, and the progressive rise of the big bourgeoisie delays the development of proletarian trade unions and propels the advance of a white nationalist unity set against the black and native races. The white labor aristocracy thus begins to grow out of these material conditions as skilled craftsmen who most often did not necessarily see their interests as distinct from capital, who viewed their craft associations not as an organ of class defense, but purely of economic elevation, would often organize their unions in association with the bosses in a monopolist and protectionist way to keep out labor competition.